Hello everyone, this is Monica here. Today I'm bringing you this card that I created with a new release from Studio Katia. This particular stamp is called Spring Roses. It comes with a cluster of roses and also these beautiful sentiments. I especially like the font. You're gonna see how easily I created this card using very few materials. I started by selecting a color cardstock, in this case this sort of aqua green, and I inked the edges of the cardstock with matching inks. This is just to create some depth and intensity just around the edges of the cardstock. This cardstock I trimmed slightly bigger than an A2 card, and I just went around all the edges. I started with, I believe, two colors of ink, and then just at the very end, I added a little bit more at the edges again. But these cards or these panels, are going to be trimmed, so don't worry too much about that, about being too specific or too detailed on the edges. Then I sprinkle a ton of anti-static powder. I just went around and I was very, very generous with it all over the car, just to make sure that I didn't get any embossing powder after I added the watermark ink. This is very important because once you stamped and add your embossing powder, it's kind of frustrating when you when you get so much embossing powder in the areas where you don't want it. So then I grabbed my cluster, my roses, and I randomly stamped them around the edges using just a basic watermark ink. Any brand you use, it's good. You could potentially, for this particular color of embossing powder that I was going to use, you could potentially use a color watermark or another ink if you feel more comfortable, if you want to see more, because really the lines are going to be covered anyway. But I was comfortable using the water-based ink, so I just left it like that. And I just chose kind of like an L shape style or design on this panel. And then I went ahead with my sparkly embossing powder, making sure that I covered all the stamped areas. And here I had just a few, not much, but then I went with a brush, a fine brush, and removed the excess of embossing powder. And of course, I heat set it with my uh, heating gun. The key here is just to make sure you have a very hot heating gun or heating tool before starting to set the embossing powder on your cardstock. Just when on the top and on the back, I always like to do that, and it also helps to prevent warping. I just tapped it every now and then just to make sure I didn't have any excess. Then on a piece of vellum, I went ahead and stamped again the exact same stamp, the cluster, the roses, beautiful roses. And in this case, I use again water-based watermark ink and the exact same embossing powder. This is like a shimmery aqua, or yeah, like a shimmery blue. It has a lot of sparkles, and the sparkles are in different tones of aqua too. It's really pretty. So went ahead and stamped it, make sure I had a very nice impression, and apply the embossing powder on it. So this is the one I call the green card, but I actually end up making this card in two other colors, a purple one and a yellow one, but I use white embossing powder instead of color embossing powder. And I invite you to take a look at Kathia's blog and and see those the photos of pictures of those cards. But really, they were done basically using the same technique, the same method. Now I was happy with the roses here, and I grabbed a piece of aqua or similar color cardstock. This is more like a light teal color, and I was gonna choose hello you for the sentiment, but then I dropped a U, wasn't happy with it, and I just decided to use a hello. I really, really liked the fonts here on the capital letters on these bigger sentiments. I stamped it with a watermarking, but in this case, I'm going to use white embossing powder and heat set it. And I really like the way the white stands out against this cardstock. And for the other cards, I use black cardstock and on white embossing powder. Then I use my matching die to die cut the roses, run it through my die cutting machine, set it aside, and then just simply trim my sentiment. I didn't want to be too fussy about it. I could have used a die cut, but I just went ahead and cut it straight. And I'm gonna go now to and assemble my card. I had cut from textured plain cardstock. Another layer that always like to put on top of a card base, and I'm using Katia's glue, very strong glue, to adhere it on top of a card base. And then I'm going to found mount the green panel that I had actually trimmed, previously trimmed. And this foam tape is actually, I believe, new from Studio Katia. I just got it. And I particularly like that it's super easy to remove the backing. If you like to use foam tape, I find sometimes quite frustrating that releasing the other side of the tape, it's a little bit annoying. In this case, it peels off super fast, as you see here. And then I adhered that main panel, or yeah, I guess front panel or green panel, on top of the white one. And as you see, it's trimmed down quite a bit, so that's why I tell you not to worry too much about the edges when you're inking them. And then add my vellum roses on top of it. I always like to hide the glue that I use for the roses, or sorry, for when I'm using vellum. So one trick is to add the sentiment or the embellishments. So usually you add a little bit of embellishment, and then you can hide the glue with it. And I use the same foam tape for the sentiment as well, as you can see here, just to add a little bit more dimension. And I was really happy with it. Always use my T-ruler just to make sure that the sentiment is centered. This is the best way I found to make sure that the sentiment looks nice and straight. And I'm using here iridescent magnolia sequence, just to add that extra textured and extra spark to the cards. And this is it, it's done. I invite you to visit the Studio Katia blog for more details about this project. This was Monica once again. Thank you so much for watching, and see you next time. Bye.